I know you've experienced this before. I know you've had a terrible week before and you've perceived everything wrongly and you've become embittered, you become frustrated, you've become grumpy, you've become all of those things, complaining, whatever. You step into the house of God, you step into the sanctuary of God with thankfulness in your heart. You start to worship him for who he is, and all of a sudden, all of the perspective on all of those things completely changes, and now you see it different, and you realize because you have him, you have everything. I know you've experienced it before. I've experienced it before. And that's why it so matters to get in the sanctuary of God, to get into that place of worship, to get into that place of prayer, because without it, we see incorrectly. That happens in the Psalms that you can actually kind of watch happen over and over again is that you'll see that the worshiper that is writing the psalm, the worshiper that has penned the psalm, will be in this place of almost complaining or kind of crying out to God and basically talking about how awful their situation is. And then there will be a moment, you can observe it in so many Psalms. Psalm 69 is one of them, but where they've been complaining, they've been talking about how bad things are and my enemies are prospering and so on and so forth. And then there's a moment where you can tell that the focus completely shifts, that that what they're magnifying completely shifts. Even that Psalm 69 that I talked about, that psalm shifts immediately when the psalmist goes into, oh, let us magnify the name of the Lord together. And so I love observing this in the Psalms, and I spend a lot of time in the Psalms because it is the language of worship. It is the language of prayer. But there's a psalm in particular that I want to bring to you today, which is Psalm 73. And it's another one of these psalms where the writer is going through this list of complaints, and the main complaint being that he's watching the enemy prosper. He's watching, he's pondering this complaint about the wicked prospering, and he says, I'm envious of the arrogant because I've seen the prosperity of the wicked. And he gets even down to verse 13 in Psalm 73, where he says, surely in vain I have kept my heart pure. He's like, is this following you thing for nothing, God? Like, have I kept my heart pure for no reason? Because I'm sitting here struggling and I'm watching the envious, I'm watching the wicked prosper. And so it's another one of these psalms where you just have this long list of these complaints about the wicked prospering, and the person that is singing the psalm is like complaining, I guess, basically about their situation. And then there's this moment that hits in Psalm 73 where you can see the shift happen. And I don't know about you, but I like to think of, in these psalms, I like to think of these as the writers have been pouring this psalm out in their heart, like that's the moment where they felt the presence of God shift their perspective. And so I know that all the psalms were written in so many different ways and all of that kind of stuff, but it seems clear to me that these people came to God with their junk, but when they got into the presence of God, when they got into that place of worship, you can watch as their perspective completely shifts. And I want to talk about one of those shifts right now. So there's a moment in Psalm 73:15, which says this: if I had said, I will speak thus, behold, I would have betrayed the generation of your children. So he's saying, okay, so he's gone through this whole list of complaints, and he's like, now behold, if I were to say, I'm gonna speak this out. Like, he's pondering all of this in his heart, and he's going, but I'm not gonna speak out, because if I were to speak it out, that word for betrayed is literally the word to act treacherously, deceitfully, or deal treacherously. There's like this defiling, deceiving thing. And so he's like, if I were to take this struggle I'm having with you, God, because I'm watching the righteous in myself, I'm watching myself struggle, and I'm watching the wicked prosper. If I were to say, I'm gonna complain about her, I'm gonna speak it out with my mouth, behold, I would have defiled your children, I would have deceived your children, because I'm recognizing that my perspective is off. What he's saying is, if I were to speak this out, I would actually deceive your children, because this is it. While it seems to be true, it seems to be true right now, and we've all been in this situation where it feels like, man, it's the wicked that are prospering and it's the righteous that are not, right? We seem to look at everything and be like, everyone's prospering except for me. So he's saying, if I were to speak this out with my mouth, I would actually deceive the children of God, because I would actually be giving them a skewed perspective on how things are shaking out, on how things are going. So he says, if I had said, I will speak thus, behold, I would have betrayed the generation of your children. I would have deceived these people by letting that skewed perspective come out of my mouth. And then it says, when I pondered to understand this, it was troublesome in my sight. So he's going, man, if I would let this out with my mouth, if I would take this skewed perspective and I would start spewing it out, I could deceive and defile God's own children. He's saying, he's recognizing in this moment, his perspective is messed up. His perspective is skewed. And he's like, I better not speak out of this place. I better not speak out of this place, because I'm going to misrepresent him. And then there's the shift. There's the big shift right here at this point. And it says this, 17, this is a huge word. The first word is until. Right? So he says, if I will speak thus, behold, I would have betrayed the generation of your children. When I pondered to understand this, it was troublesome in my sight until I came into the sanctuary of God, then I perceived their end. Think about that. Stop for a second. He's had all this long list of complaints, and he's like recognizing, my perspective is off. Something is skewed, something is wrong, and I don't want to speak it out, because I don't want to give a misrepresentation of you, God. I'm recognizing that what's coming out of my mouth isn't right. And then he says, until I came into the sanctuary of God. The sanctuary of God is that place of prayer, that place of worship. He said, when I came in the sanctuary, until I came in the sanctuary, then at that point, then I perceived, right? Then I perceived. So in other words, his perspective was off, but when he got into that place of worship, when he got into that place of prayer, when he got into that abiding place of the presence of God, then his perception changed. It was at that point, then he perceived their end. It's like he actually saw things for what they were. And so you have right here, he's completely skewed perspective, until I came into the sanctuary of God, then I perceived. There's something about this, about worship. This is why I talk about it being so crucial for people to not miss the assembly, to not miss worshiping with other people and all that kind of stuff, not because of some religious requirement, but it's like the longer you spend away from the sanctuary, from that abiding place, from that place of worship and prayer, like you can have it in your own individual life. I'm not saying you can't, but I'm just saying that we tend to, when we stay away from corporate worship and all that, we tend to drift away, and our perspective starts getting more and more and more skewed. And yet when we are in this sanctuary, in this place of worship, in this place of prayer, that place of the abiding presence, it's like we come in and all our skewed perspective, it's like, boom, then I perceived. Once I came into the sanctuary, then I perceived. I'm going to finish the psalm and then we'll finish up with some other thoughts. But it says, then I perceived their end. Surely you set them down in slippery places. You cast them down to destruction. How they were destroyed in a moment. They were utterly swept away by sudden terrors. Like a dream when one awakes, O Lord, when aroused, you will despise their form. So he's saying, I perceive that even though it looks like they're prospering, even though it looks like they're winning right now, even though it looks like darkness is overtaking, when I come into the sanctuary and see the victorious one, I see the end for them. And then it says, when my heart was embittered, when I was pierced within, then I was senseless and ignorant. There's this sense of when my heart was embittered, there is this bitterness that breeds a lack of perception, and it breeds ignorance. He's saying, I recognize that I was getting embittered and it was skewing my perspective. But what changed that is when I came into the sanctuary of God, when I came into that place of worship, when I came into that place of abiding presence where I worship and where I pray. At that point in the sanctuary, then I was able to perceive. But when his heart was embittered, when he was pierced within, he was senseless and ignorant. And he says, I was like a beast before you. Nevertheless, I am continually with you. You have taken hold of my right hand. With your counsel, you will guide me, and afterward receive me to glory. And then he says this, whom have I in heaven but you? And besides you, I desire nothing on earth. So you can see the perspective starting to lift. He's starting to turn his gaze up to heaven again. It's like he was looking around at all the prospering of the wicked, and he got embittered. And then he comes to the sanctuary and perceives the immediate presence of God. He perceives the power and the victory of God. He perceives things as they really are, perceives the end of his enemies, the end of the wickedness. And at that point, he turns his eyes heavenward and he says this, whom have I in heaven but you? And besides you, I desire nothing on earth. He was just complaining about the wicked prospering on earth. And now, once he turned his eyes, his perspective returned back to the right place, and he looked up to heaven and perceived God in heaven. He says this, besides you, I desire nothing on earth. How quickly things can change in the presence of God. How quickly things can change when we get into the sanctuary. I know you've experienced this before. I know you've had a terrible week before, and you've perceived everything wrongly, and you've become embittered, you've become frustrated, you've become grumpy, you've become all of those things, complaining, whatever. You step into the house of God, you step into the sanctuary of God with thankfulness in your heart, you start to worship him for who he is, and all of a sudden, all of the perspective on all of those things completely changes, and now you see it different, and you realize because you have him, you have everything. I know you've experienced it before. I've experienced it before. And that's why it so matters to get in the sanctuary of God, to get into that place of worship, to get into that place of prayer, because without it, we see incorrectly. And besides you, I desire nothing on earth. My flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. Behold, those who are far from you will perish. You have destroyed all those who are unfaithful to you. And this verse is so good. Verse 28 means so much to me. But as for me, the nearness of God is my good. I have made the Lord my refuge, that I may tell of all your works. So he's saying, my perspective was off. It was bitter. I was frustrated. My perspective was skewed until I came into the sanctuary, until I became aware of the immediate presence of God, and my eyes got fixed back on heaven. As for me, the nearness of God is my good. His nearness is my good. And then he says, and I see the rest of it, the wicked prospering, all of that stuff. I see it actually for what it is. And it's almost like I'm perceiving this here, but it's almost like in the Psalm, what he's saying is, I see the wicked prospering. I see all of this happening. I get in the sanctuary. My perspective changes. I realize because I have him, I have everything, and his nearness is my good. It's almost like he's saying to the wicked, y'all can have it. You can have your prosperity. You can have all of the stuff. You can have all those riches. You can keep prospering in the way that the world prospers. But here's what I know. Y'all can have that because I have this. I have the nearness of God. It is the nearness of God that is my good. Y'all can have your prospering. Y'all can have your wicked ways. You can have it because what I have is his nearness, and the nearness of God is my good. And what I also noticed about this is that he stops himself. He goes, if I had said, I will speak thus, if I had said that, if he's like, if I were to speak about this, he actually stopped himself from speaking out of this skewed perspective. He stopped himself from saying it because he didn't want to deceive and he didn't want to defile. It's almost like he said, I wanted to say, I had some thoughts, I had some feelings, I had some stuff that I was angry about, and I wanted to say it, but I recognized that it was coming from a skewed perspective, a skewed heart, and he waited. I wanted to say it, but I got into the sanctuary instead. I got into the place of worship. I got into that place of prayer. I got into that place of abiding presence. And in that place, I wasn't going to speak out of that skewed place because I wasn't going to deceive and I wasn't going to defile. Instead, what I did was ran into the sanctuary. And when I ran into the sanctuary, when I saw it for what it is, what came out of my mouth changed. Sometimes the reason some of us are so bitter, sometimes the reason of us are so gross with our words, sometimes the reason why some of us are so callous and cold and hard is because it's been way too long since we've run into that place of sanctuary. Sure, we may have attended church, but I'm talking about in your heart going, I want to say, I know what I want to say, and I feel embittered and I feel angry, but what I recognize is that I'm ignorant and that my perspective is skewed. So I run into that place of the presence of God. I run into that place of sanctuary, and in that place, I see it rightly, and what I talk about changes. And by the end of the psalm, he ends on this: as for me, y'all have what y'all have. You guys are getting what you're getting, but here's what's right for me. As for me, the nearness of God is my good. And I just want to encourage you. I want to pray this for you today, that you would run today into the sanctuary of God. You have some things that you may even be right about. You may even be perceiving it rightly, but you're perceiving it rightly in your mind with the wrong heart. There are so many things that we have a skewed perspective on until we get into the immediate presence of God. And I just want to encourage you today, run into the sanctuary. Hold your tongue. Don't say it yet. Run into the sanctuary and watch how God will change what comes out of your mouth. Maybe, just maybe, when you run into him, when you run into this place, this very thing that you're so mad about, the very thing that you're so frustrated about, when you get into the immediate presence of God, maybe what happens is that it gets purified in you, and you go, actually, on earth, I desire nothing besides you. I only want you. As for me, the nearness of God is my good. Maybe the thing that is bothering you so bad and ruining your week and ruining your month and turning your perspective all these different ways and just eating your absolute lunch, maybe it's not actually that big of a problem. Maybe the problem is that you haven't run into the sanctuary. Maybe your perspective needs to be changed in the immediate presence of God, that you would turn your gaze up to heaven again and recognize, who have I in heaven but you? The nearness of God is my good. I want to bless you with that today. The nearness of God is your good. So run into the sanctuary today. I bless you to run into the sanctuary today in Jesus' name.